Namaskar. Today we are going to discuss about disaster management planning. We know that disaster management is having different phases. Few activities we are taking up before disaster, some activities are during disaster, and some activities post disaster. Just have a look on the disaster management cycle. What we are taking up pre-emergency or pre-disaster, what we are doing during disaster, and what we are doing post-disaster. In pre-disaster phase, preparedness, mitigation and prevention, these are the three basic components, and among all the activities are taken in that particular preparedness, prevention and mitigation. Once it comes to the disaster, the response time, when the disaster has happened, then search, rescue, evacuation, first aid and all sort of things, it takes place during the emergency time. Even in post disaster, we have certain short term recovery, long term recovery, reconstruction is there, rehabilitation is there. So this is the basic overall structure of disaster management cycle. Today we are going to discuss about how we go for disaster management planning. The model, the structure which we are going to discuss now, it has been primarily taken from the Australian model, which is very much valid and very much correlated with our system. So let us start discussion that what is management, what is risk management, and what is disaster risk management. In all, we have the same process, but a little bit deviation is there in that. In management, we define problems, we do the research, we analyze, we take decision, we implement, monitor, review and communication and consult. This is the process of general management. But once we come to the risk management, we establish the context, establish a strategy, organizational or risk management context, develop risk evaluation criteria, decide the structure. If we are talking about the research in the same risk management, the second step where we identify the risk, what can happen and how it can happen. Talking about the risk analysis, here determining existing control, what control system you have at this moment so that you can curb out the risk. Determine likelihood and consequences. If something goes wrong, what is going to happen, and establish the level of risk. In decision making, you evaluate the risk, compare against the criteria, what criteria you have, and compare with the consequences, how it is coming up, set the risk priority, what risk you are going to take in the first phase, and decide on risk acceptability. Then you go for treating the risk, identify treatment option, evaluate treatment option. Might be there are certain treatment options which is very costly, and there are certain things which is cost effective. So you have to see which one will be better for you, select treatment option and then implement, prepare the implementation plan, implement the plan, and same control and monitor and communication and consult will be existing. Now let us come focused on disaster risk management. In disaster risk management, we start with establishing the context as we have seen in the risk management and also in the management system. Define the problem, establish risk, emergency risk management framework, develop the risk evaluation criteria. In the second phase, identify the risk, identify the hazard, vulnerability and risk of the area. In risk analysis, we go for determining the likelihood and the consequences. And once we are coming to the decision making, evaluating the risk, what are the risks, and you evaluate and according to that set the priorities. Then you go for treating the priority risk, important risk which you cannot avoid it, you have to go for identifying the options, how you can treat it, evaluate the options, like you can go for the cost benefit analysis of the mitigation strategies and then select the options. Implementation, plan, prepare a plan and implement the implement action you have to take. Monitor and consultation, it is the basic thing which will keep on going for either you go for management, either you go for risk management or you are going for disaster risk management. Let us have a look at the model which has been given by Australian Emergency Management Institute, and it is very much valid, I can say, and in the process of evolving the plan, we need to go through the establishing the context, identifying the risk, analyzing the risk, evaluating the risk. If you are accepting, then it's all right, or if you know, then you go for treatment of risk. At the same time, communication and consultation and monitor and review, that goes parallelly together in all the steps. Now let us see one by one how we are going to establish the risk. Define the problem. What problems the region is having, the area is having, that you have to first of all work it out. Then establish the disaster management framework. Might be you have already the disaster management framework for the area, for the region, for the geographical location. You need to have the factors to be considered, including any or all of the factors following, like the stakeholders, applicable management arrangement, applicable legislation and policy, political and economic circumstances, social and culture issues. The key to establishing the disaster management is to identify the stakeholders and establish the communication, consultation and participation framework for applying to disaster management process. Now, how we are going to develop the risk evaluation criteria? The criteria should be through interaction with the community, with the stakeholders, with the victims, and they all should be taken into account, and all are required to be consulted, evaluated, like how basically they have to go about, what is their views, what they feel about the risk. Those things we have to look, and it can be based on technical, economical, legal, social, humanitarian and other criteria as determined by the stakeholders. Method for establishing the context. What are the methods by which you can establish the context? Maybe it is through the established policies, establish the risk management in a strategic context, develop the risk evaluation criteria. Now, establishing the policies. The policy for disaster risk management will come from various different areas. It is necessary to obtain national and state level policies on disaster management, identify other issues, policies and related legislation, like emergency management might be for disaster management, your state or your district is having certain policies, land use planning, control development, environmental resource management, natural disaster relief management and arrangement, emergency services, national disaster management committee or a state or territory disaster management committee. So these are the few areas where you may look for your area specific disaster management plans and legislation. So this will help out in a big way. Establish the risk management and a strategic context. Describe the community objective found in a strategic plan for community, local government, region, district or the state. Identify community expectations and community risk perception. Now, develop risk evaluation criteria. Inform the community that we are going to evolve certain structure for disaster management planning. You participate, you tell everybody to talk about it, give their inputs, give their feedback, and based on that the risk evaluation criteria has to be evolved while planning itself. Consider what is acceptable to the community in the following category of elements at risk, maybe loss of life, economic losses, environmental harm, lifeline damages, social infrastructure damage or loss of heritage. Develop series of draft statements for each of the category, bearing in mind the legal requirements, cost and equity. Some risks are unacceptable, risks should be kept low as acceptable, and the form and language of evaluation criteria must match with risk analysis statement. Publish the draft in the community and monitor and review the risk evaluation criteria through the disaster management process. This I would like to say, the risk evaluation criteria is very, very important. Unless until the risk evaluation criteria is not established, we cannot compare the risk and we cannot suggest the real treatment process, like how the risk can be treated. Now let us come to the identifying the risk. It is very interesting how we can identify the risk. There are three basic things which we have to take into account. One is the hazard, second is the vulnerability, and third is the risk. Now let us see how we are going to identify those risks. Identify risk requires a detailed investigation of the characteristics and interactions of the hazard, community and the environment, which forms the basis of solving the problem. Identify and describe the hazards. What are the different type of hazards? Broadly we can define. Maybe the natural hazards, technological hazards, biological, civil and political hazards. So these are the basic how we can define. Together we have the different way of defining this hazards, like it might be geological and geological hazards. Maybe you can define as hydrological and meteorological hazards, then biological hazards, accident related hazards, and nuclear, chemical, industrial hazards. So these are the ways, and you can define the categories of hazards in the different way. The process of identifying and describing the hazard examines the information in field, including likelihood, spatial distribution, intensity, speed of onset, duration, and the concern that the hazard arouses in the community. Identify and describing the community. A community may be identified by geographically based grouping, shared experiencing grouping, sector based groups, functionally based groups. The process of identifying and describing a community examines information in the field, including population size, spatial distribution, remoteness, prior experience and perception of hazards, degree of exposure to the hazards, capacity to affect the environment or hazard, access to resources, and susceptibility or resilience to the hazard. Identify and describing the environment. Built environment, there might be n number of categories, but broadly we have taken three types, that is the built environment, physical environment, and social environment. The process of identifying and describing the environment examines information in the field, including the degree of mitigation affected on the hazards, degree of protection afforded to the community, and susceptibility or resilience to the hazard. What are the way of identifying and the risk? Identify and describing the hazards, identify and describe the community and the environment, a scope vulnerability, that what are the people, what are the built environment, built infrastructure which is susceptible to the disaster, generate risk assessment, and revisit risk evaluation criteria. Now, how to identify and describe hazards? There are different ways by which we can identify the hazards. Might be the researching the past disaster history, existing hazard and vulnerability, examining the literature, requesting information from government, maybe the maps you can go through and you can really finding it, maybe brainstorming by the planning groups will we also work out certain hazards existing in the area, and considering checklists. That also gives us a very clear picture of what type of hazards it will be, the area will be having. 5 basic characteristics that you can describe the hazards. What are the 5 categories? Might be the intensity, how big, how fast, how powerful, likelihood, the chance of hazard causing the emergency, extent, what area is going to be affected, time frame, warning time, duration, time, or might be within a day, or within a day what time you will be having the disaster, within a month or within the season when you will be having the disaster, and manageability, like whether you can manage it or not. Then you have scoping the vulnerability. The vulnerability is the function of resilience and susceptibility. The scoping of vulnerability involves looking for sections of the community and environment that are noticeably less resilient or more susceptible to the hazards. That is the basic definition of vulnerability. Like the segment of society which is prone or which is resistant to the hazards or the impact of the hazard, that is called vulnerability. Some vulnerability indicators includes the proximity to the hazard. How close you are to the hazard. More you are closer, you will be more vulnerable. Income level, poverty level, if your economic status is low, so definitely the resilience factor is not proper and it is less, so you will be having more of losses. Socio-economic status, it also affects in a big way. Level of awareness, if you are ignorant about the disaster may come and you will be badly hit by the disaster. Generate risk assessment. A risk assessment describes a reasonable relationship between the hazard and the elements at risk. So it must be systematic, and results in carefully structured information. So this is the basic we discussed about the identifying the risk. Now let us come to the analyzing the risk. How we can analyze the risk? The information procedures will be also assist the process of developing the risk treatment options. The predicted likelihood and expected consequences of risk should be estimated either qualitatively or quantitatively based on the description of hazards and the degree of vulnerability of the community and the environment. Modeling can be done. There are different ways by which you can do the modeling. Might be you go for physical modeling, virtual modelings are there, mathematical modelings are there, intuitive modelings are there, and there are a number of ways, the methods are there, like determining the likelihood and consequences scenario study. There are certain ways by which you can do the scenario study of the disaster, and that gives you a clear picture that how much building stock is going to be affected, how many people will be affected in a cross-sectional population, how much gender specific, like how many ladies will be affected, how many gents will be affected, how many kids, how many senior citizens are going to be affected. So those things are coming in your risk analysis. Then evaluating the risk. How you can evaluate the risk? The first thing is that compare risk against the criteria. We have discussed about it. How basically you are consulting the community, you are talking to the community and getting the idea that how should be the risk evaluation criteria, and based on that now you go to the site, you go to the field and assess the hazards and risk, and based on that you compare whether it is acceptable or it is not acceptable. Set risk priority. Might be the area where you are doing the study or you are making the disaster management plan, the area might have 10 disasters including the man-made and natural disasters, but there are certain disasters which is acceptable, the risks are acceptable and certain are not. So you have to set the priorities, risk priority, and decide on the risk acceptability. As I told you, the community is having certain resilience, so the community is also knowing that what level of disaster and what level of risk that the community can accept it, and after that they cannot. So that particular evaluation of risk is required to be done. What are the methods available for evaluating the risk? Compare the risk evaluation criteria with the risk statement which has been allocated label of risk. Prioritize risk using the risk labels and determine which risk is acceptable. Label of risk and possible course of action. Now you see there are 4 labels: extreme risk, high risk, moderate and low risk. If you see the extreme risk, you will be finding that immediate action is required, execution attention is required, and further research recommended on scenario analysis. If you go to the high risk, action required of course, senior management attention is required and further research recommendation on the scenario analysis. Moderate risk, some action may be required and management responsibility must be specified. And then low risk, action may not be required and management by routine procedure. So this is basically how you go for evaluating the risk, based on whether it is acceptable or whether it is not acceptable. If acceptable, okay, we can go for monitoring and reviewing. If it is not, then we start going for treatment of risk. Treatment of risk is very complex rather, because you might have 5 disasters that you have taken into account. For that you have opted for one disaster, there might be 5 different approach for mitigating and treating the risk. All are having different background, different cost required, logistics required, different resources required. Based on that, you require to really trade off how you can mix the risk, treatments, how you can composite the risk treatments, and which will be the best one. So you need to do the cost benefit analysis, and based on that you really start going for optimizing and pinning down to a particular strategy that you will be utilizing for risk treatment. So that is very important. Then let us come to the point of communication and consultation. This is very important process, where in each step Either we are going for establishing the context, identifying the risk, analyzing or evaluating the risk, or treatment of risk. In each step, communication and consultation is very, very important. And at the same time, monitoring and review process has to go simultaneously. So this is the basic structure. We need to understand that there is a problem, and once the problem is there, there is a underlying causes to it, and we must know about it. And once the causes are known to us, so treatment is quite possible. So based on that, the three concepts, like we have extended further, like establishing the context, identifying the risk, analyzing and evaluating the risk, accepting the risk, or treatment of risk, and then we treat it. But in core conclusion, I can say that cause, problem, cause and remedy, there are three things which we need to account always for any type of management. And disaster management is also a type of management which requires to curb the risk and the level of risk, and how we can reduce the impact of disaster by some sort of intervention, and disaster management planning is one of them. So today's lecture we discussed about how and what is the process of disaster management planning. Thank you very much.